Okay, so welcome to episode, I'm not sure, of The Digger. Last week I told you that maybe I'd change the name of the podcast to The Paradigm, because that's the kind of thing I want to talk about on the podcast. But I couldn't really ask for a better guest to talk about those things than Steve Patterson. Hello, Steve.
Hi there, Phil. Thanks for having me.
So this is a bit of an impromptu podcast. I'm not going to bore you guys with the details as to why, but Steve and I got talking. He has a podcast called In Pursuit with Patterson. What is it?
Patterson in Pursuit.
There you go. And stevepatterson.substack.com. And we were talking, and Steve sent me one of his articles about how we've just come out of I'm preempting this, that we've been living in a dark age. Steve, are we living in a dark age?
I think we have been living in a dark age, and maybe I'm biased or pathologically optimistic, but I think we're coming to the end of the dark age. There's a lot of people who are very pessimistic right now, and maybe they feel like we're slipping into a dark age. They're sort of aware that there's some information games being played right now, that the paradigms are murky, the narratives that we've been told might not be true. And I think that makes people feel like things are getting worse. But in my opinion, I see so many people who are suddenly becoming aware to these games afoot that I think we might be leaving one. So I wrote this article a few years ago because I have been doing independent research for many, many years. And I was coming to some startling conclusions that some fundamental and important, cherished ideas in different domains of thought were likely incorrect, and some of them were just really bad ideas. So we had briefly spoken a minute ago. In America, we have one of our regulatory agencies has created what they call the food pyramid, and it's supposed to be like nutritional advice of what a healthy diet is. And from what I can tell, it looks like the food pyramid is the exact opposite of the truth.
Yeah.
And like the authorities are recommending these ideas that are not just wrong, but really, really bad. And there's 1,000 examples I can give. And anyway, I made these discoveries in different domains, and I thought, okay, I'm no longer feel like, oh, this is some unique scientific scandal. I actually think this has been the norm for like a century in all sorts of different areas, including some of the harder sciences. And so anyway, I wrote this article, and it does have an optimistic flavor because I do think maybe we're finally coming to the end of it, thanks to things like the internet and people being able, dissidents having a voice that maybe would have been silenced in previous decades.
Yes. I mean, when you sent it to me, I think the phrase was the thing that initially caught my eye. I think you said something to me like, hey, so we've been living in a dark age, right? Or something really casually like that. And I was thinking, no, are we? And but of course, once you start to consider it, it's not that crazy of an idea, really, because I mean, I remember being in GCSE, that's our what you would call high school education. We would learn, strangely enough, we learned about the history of medicine, which is strange that I would now find myself many years later almost at random writing about that subject matter. And the broad thrust of the things that we were taught, which is interesting when you think about it, was how absurd it was that people were being treated with these treatments for hundreds of years. Things
Right.
like the 4 elements, or maybe your air is out of balance with your water is out of balance. People queued up metaphorically for these treatments, which of course, by today's standards, are now demonstrated to be rooted in not rational thought. And so to jump forward to where we are now, I think the angle about all of this stuff that's particularly interesting to me, is not necessarily trying to interrogate the truth of the matter, which I think is incredibly important, but it's about the ability of people to acknowledge or not acknowledge these things, because I think our society believes it's the most rational that's ever been. We've cast aside the dogma of religion because Darwinism arrived, and we've entered into a new era of rationality where things are measured, considered, and there's a sort of professional, corporate-like attitude of things are done properly. Particularly this perspective exists in the West, that everything is being done right and the people are doing right by their jobs, right by their perspectives. And these scientists are very carefully measuring this and that and the other. And you'll hear this phrase all the time. Scientists say that, scientists have learned that. And it's creating this culture where people think we have the answers to so many things. And what's interesting about what you found or what you expressed in your article is that you don't have to look that far across a whole range of disciplines to see, whoa, there's a pattern emerging here. What you think might be unique to medical science, for those who dare to say that there's a problem at the heart of medical publishing and medical literature, I'm seeing the same thing elsewhere.
Yes.
And suddenly you're like, whoa, maybe Houston, we have a problem.
A few ideas here. One is, I think what you're tracking is, let's call it social epistemology. So epistemology is the study of knowledge. How do we know things? What are different mechanisms for knowing? And to say it's social epistemology is to say, how does knowledge get transmitted from person to person in societies? So we could tell a very naive story about, let's say, scientific progress, where we go, the progress is strictly linear, and like brilliant people publish articles and then their peers read those articles and they, vet them through peer review. And then, the next decade they're building on top of those foundations and everything marches forward. But that's not the case at all. That is so rare it might not exist. What appears to be is that there are individual researchers who gain prestige or status or authority for some reason. Maybe they got a grant to do some research. And then immediately there are non-governmental political dynamics that take hold. So it's, interpersonal relationships are way more important than the truth. So you'll have these little factions that will emerge, and they're like competing for status with one another. And then a dominant narrative will be established in some time period. And after that dominant narrative gets established, it can take decades or sometimes centuries before the paradigm is changed, or the old paradigm is seen to be flawed. And I do not believe at this point this is for intellectual reasons. I believe this is almost entirely for social and political reasons. And
Right.
this was very shocking to me and very disheartening and disorienting, because I thought, like, the production of ideas, I thought, truth was paramount. But now I look at that and I think that's very nice. It's sort of like saying, you analyze politics and you go, does truth matter in politics? You would hope that, like, politicians are really interested in the truth and they speak the truth. But the more you learn about how politics actually works in the world, that's kind of a childish, naive perspective. It's so far away from the truth. It's almost anti-truth.
Yeah. Let's put some meat on the bones here and use a concrete example, because I think even if our examples are not strictly true, I want to give people an example of what I think it is that we're talking about here. And I'm going to speak grossly out of line, but broadly, that's why we're here, right? Because we are of the view that there are big problems that are not addressed. So I'm not going to fall on one side of the debate or the other here. But an example of this, I saw a talk last year before, maybe 18 months ago, at an idea festival in London. It's all very kind of middle class and sunny and flat whites in the park and this kind of a thing. And people get together and watch all these interesting lectures by these very big-brained, interesting people. And it's a great festival. I enjoy it. I've only been once. It's called How the Light Gets In. And I went there specifically because there was a guy called Eric Lerner talking. Do you know of this guy? Mm-mm. So Eric Lerner, he'd put this article out. And as you can tell, I'm a bit of a contrarian. So if someone puts their name to something that is greatly at odds with what everybody else says, and I'm thinking, I understand the gravity of the situation they've put themselves in. I'm like, what? Go on, tell me your case. He went to this fairly mainstream ideas festival and made the case that the Big Bang Theory is completely wrong. And I was like, okay, well, you're going to have to show me why, right? Not that I could even understand it in principle anyway, which is broadly the point, right? It's at that stage you realize we're actually not the rational society we think we are. I'm choosing one learned wise man over another because I'm not actually equipped to have read all of the literature and critiqued it and understood it. I have to listen to a holy man tell me, hey,
Right.
I read it all and I've looked at all of the data, and guess what? It's wrong. And then I have to listen to somebody else make the case the other way around. So he stood up and he made what appeared to me a very, very credible argument that the Big Bang Theory is completely on its knees. Now, listeners who are raging about me even suggesting such a thing, like I say, I'm not going to fall on one side of the discussion or the other. All I would say is that he made a very credible case, and he claimed that the theory is on life support, and I think he listed something like 15 or 16 different theoretical constructs that had been layered on top of the Big Bang Theory to keep it on life support. They kept on finding new data that didn't match the hypothesis.
Yeah,
And then
yeah.
another piece of data would be found that didn't match the hypothesis. And so they would accommodate this initial idea that the universe is expanding and the Big Bang Theory is the reason for that,
Yeah.
and kept on changing it. And eventually what happens in this story, again, I don't know what the truth of all of this is the James Webb telescope gets launched, right? And the scientists are expecting to see a certain thing that matches their hypothesis of the Big Bang Theory of the universe expanding and all of these different things. And the data that's coming back from the James Webb telescope is problematic. And I think I've seen a couple of articles that have since emerged of cosmology now in crisis. It's a very complicated issue. But this idea that maybe, and it's a big maybe, a an assumption or a theory as well known, as well understood by the lay public that sits at the heart of so much rational thought in our society is now has a couple of question marks around it and some terminal problems is broadly the kind of thing that we're discussing here.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much in there. Oh my gosh, Phil. Yeah, so it's amazing that we haven't connected before today because, wow, there's just so much to say. This is like exactly what I'm researching. So if you'll let me monologue for a little bit,
Yeah, for sure.
there's like a few concepts here I really wanna try to communicate. I was writing them down so I didn't forget because there's so much going on. Okay, so first let's start with a historical example. So what has happened as a theory gets developed, a scientific theory gets developed, it will eventually, inevitably, run into problems. There will be observations that don't match with models, and you go, okay, we expect to see X, we don't see X. What do we do? Well, there's a lot of things one can do when presented with evidence that doesn't match the model. One attempt is to dismiss the evidence. That happens a lot, unfortunately. There are attempts to modify one's theory. There are other attempts to change the experiment that you're doing to see if the data will change. These are very abstract things. Let me try to give examples because there's just so much here. Okay. Example number one of my favorite examples, the Ptolemaic model of the solar system is the what people might call a geocentric model. That the idea that all the heavenly bodies revolve around the Earth, and in the Ptolemaic model in particular, the original one is they revolve around the Earth in perfect circles that are slightly. It's not like one perfect circle. It's like there's a perfect circle, perfect circle of the different heavenly bodies. And so if you look at a map, like a chart of it, it's very beautiful, looks like a flower. And that held up for a long time. But they discovered a problem, which is that sometime when they were expecting the heavenly bodies to continue along this trajectory of a perfect circle, they would actually stop and they would reverse and then they would continue. So there would be these little, it would backtrack on itself. And people were like, well, what the heck's going on here? And so the first attempt, they would call these epicycles, these little trajectory changes, and they would continue on the journey. Well, one attempt to handle that is to say, oh, well, I guess it's not perfect circles. I guess it's perfect circles with, you just add some epicycles. Every once in a while, this heavenly body will sort of change course and then continue on its path. That is one theoretical attempt at revision. That is such a good way of doing things that you could navigate from one side of the Atlantic Ocean to the other side of the Atlantic Ocean by looking at the stars that presupposed a model of the solar system that was Ptolemaic.
So it was good. It was good enough that you
Yes.
could navigate with it, even though it was wrong.
Correct. And think about the power of if you're going to have a theoretical debate, let's say in the 1400s, is the Ptolemaic model of the solar system correct? You go, of course it is. Every time we use it, my gosh, we can navigate across an entire ocean by looking at the stars. That's how clear we understand the Ptolemaic model is true. Okay. Turns out that's not what's going on, it appears. It appears that the solar system revolves around the sun. A complete paradigm shift. Maybe what's happening is it's not even the heavenly bodies are not orbiting in perfect circles around the sun. It's ellipses, and they're all like the heavenly bodies. They're like different parts of the ellipse. It's way more complicated than the Ptolemaic model. And with that model, it actually explains with total clarity what's happening when you see the epicycle, when you're in the epicycle zone and the trajectory of the planet reverses course and then it continues again. That's explained better with the Copernican model, a different model. Okay, that's example number one of a theoretical revision in the face of new data. What can you do? You can slightly adjust it. You can add an epicycle. Versus a complete paradigm shift, and you go, "Oh my gosh, maybe the solar system revolves around the sun and not the Earth." Okay, that's one example. There are many others. You were mentioning cosmology. This has come up. With the concept of dark matter and dark energy.
Yes.
Yes. So the summarized version is that the predictions that were held about how fast the universe is expanding,
Yep.
based on our prior models, were wrong.
Yeah.
It looked like it was going way faster, and we go, "What's going on?" Well, maybe that means there's mysterious forces. We're going to call them dark matter and dark energy, which are out there, which make up most of the universe. In fact, because that's how wrong the predictions are. And we're going to say, really, that's one of these constituent factors of the universe is dark matter and dark energy, so that our equations balance, and so that we have a way to predict what we observe.
Which is interesting because, I mean, for the people not stuck in the weeds of this, and I'm probably, you need to correct me if I'm wrong about this, things like the Large Hadron Collider and these kinds of huge multi-million pound and multi-million dollar experiments, including some other ones I've seen where they've dug very deep down into the earth where it's super quiet and they're trying to detect effectively what is evidence for dark matter. My understanding is they believe dark matter exists because it is required to balance the books in a hypothesis they have about how the universe works. And they've been looking extensively for 20 years, perhaps.
Well, looking is a little bit hard. I don't actually know the details of how they're trying to look. I think you might be confusing with how they try to measure gravitational waves, which is a different concept.
Yeah.
But I actually don't know the attempts to make experimental verification of dark matter, dark energy. But the theoretical idea is correct that the predictions don't work, and so a kind of a ham-fisted way to make your theory better is you go, okay, well, maybe there's dark matter and dark energy that makes up most of the universe, and maybe that gets us out of a bind. Okay, let me give you another example. This is also interesting, and I think you'll appreciate that it is not always a mistake to make ham-fisted theoretical revisions this way. I might get some of the details wrong, but the general concepts are correct. Maybe somebody will correct me here. Okay, so Einstein, right? He comes up with this theory around the turn of the 20th century, and it makes specific predictions about, I want to say I don't even have to talk about the details of the predictions. His new theory made predictions about what we're supposed to see with, it's like light traveling around bodies being bent by gravity. Okay, something like that. This is hot off the presses here, so if I get the details wrong, please forgive me. It turns out that I believe it was in the teens or the 20s of the 1900s. There was going to be, he spent some years working with academics to try to set up this experiment to get this data. And they tried to execute their experiment. It was some big telescope they had to set up. And they failed the first time that they did it because they're of weather. So it was, I don't know if it was clouds or rain or whatever. They said, oh, we have to call off this experiment. We're going to have to delay some years to see whether or not, to try to get experimental confirmation of Einstein's theory. Get this. In the meantime, after this first experiment was canceled, Einstein discovers he made a mistake. And so he revised his theory. He revised his math. So the predictions when they went out the next time were different than they were the first time. The next time they went out, they looked up at the stars, they got confirmation of Einstein's theory. Why is this important? Because imagine that there was good weather the first time they went out and they had experimental disconfirmation. And they said, oh, well, geez, Einstein's theory must have been wrong because we looked up and the predictions were wrong. And so you say, case closed, it has been falsified. Now we're going to look at different theories. Well, no, sorry. Even then, that's a little bit too fast, too soon. This is one of the problems people talk about falsification. This is one of the problems with falsification is there's a lot more going on here where it actually was fortuitous that the weather was bad so that Einstein could figure out his theoretical mistake and not throw the baby out with the bathwater and make a little theoretical vision. Go ahead.
So they actually confirmed his revised theory. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
So he had a theory, they weren't able to confirm it. He revised it. They went out, altered their experiment in some way, one presumes slightly, and then they confirmed his revised theory.
Correct.
It's almost like that thing that have you ever? It's a card example, right? But have you seen the famous meme of the dancing gorilla? Have you ever seen?
I don't think so.
So I'll play it into the thing.
Okay.
But there's a video of you've never seen the dancing gorilla, really not?
It doesn't ring a bell. Are you talking about the basketball example?
This is it, right?
Okay.
Because I thought if you hadn't seen it, we could show it. It would have been great to show you for the first time.
Yep.
But you find and see what you're looking for.
Yeah.
And if you're not looking for it, you don't find it. And that's true of the most simple things as it is of even the most complicated things. Until you go out looking for this stuff, you're never going to see it.
That is true. And that there's a whole lot packed into there because people I think are very bad, tend to be very bad in the theoretical reasoning department. And they're way too quick to jump to conclusions, like with the Einstein example, right? Because we can laugh intuitively. It seems like there's something fishy with the dark matter and dark energy concept where you go, well, my predictions did not match reality, so I'm just going to add some terms and call it dark matter, dark energy, and then we're happy. Yeah, that is kind of suspicious, but also remember, Einstein sort of changed his equations as well, and when he did that, it actually worked. And while I don't think Einstein is the final truth of the physical universe, it should just be noted that we have to be very slow when we're playing theoretical games. I did want to come to some other concepts just from what you were talking about here. So you mentioned this idea that you realize, and anybody can realize this, that there's a lot of trust involved in our intellectual informational paradigms.
Yeah, huge.
The scientists and the experts are really smart, and this is the world we live in. And then you realize, well, when I dig in my own thoughts, I go, well, really, I just heard a guy say some things who I think has authority, and it sounded plausible enough. And maybe he's got a credential. He seems like he knows what he's talking about, so I'm just going to trust him. And there's a lot going on here. For one, there's an interesting question. Can somebody who doesn't have, let's say, formal training in a domain actually gain the requisite knowledge to have informed opinions on subjects in that domain? And if so, how does that work? How do they do that? How does one do your own research? And does it vary from domain to domain? So, for example, it's not hard to think that if you have something wrong with your car and you spend enough time on YouTube, you can probably figure out what's wrong with your car, and maybe search internet forums or whatever. You tinker around in the garage, maybe you'll be able to find that out. I don't think too many people would disagree with that. But is that true with cosmology?
Well, if it were me to try and shed any light on a problem like this, I would always try and boil things down to much simpler versions of the broader question that you're asking. So your example of trying to work out what's wrong with the car, you could do that. But I don't suspect that in the world of mechanics, there is any great need for information cults inside the world of mechanics.
Yeah.
The car either starts and goes or it doesn't. The gears either shift or they do not. Where it gets trickier is when you get to complex issues. People can begin to see whatever they want to see. And I think for the lay people, dare I say, the champion of the lay people, I think you can enter a domain unperturbed by these information cults. And I'll give you a simple example. I was in Los Angeles years ago, and I've been interested in cults for a long time. We did some stuff about cults on Truth Loader for anybody who remembers those shows. It was a strange time. I mean, I'm talking like literal cults as people understand them. Like you join them, there's some charismatic leader. But as we were discussing earlier, they exist inside information spheres as well, and people adhere to these, right? So I was in LA and I was talking to some Scientologists, and now my view is that Scientology is a cult. I know that some people won't believe that, but like that's how I interpret it. But I'm not Christian, I'm not a Muslim, I'm not a Hindu, I'm not a Buddhist, and I'm not a Scientologist. I consider myself a sort of an intellectual omnivore. And so as I'm talking to this person, I'm realized I am completely untroubled by any of the previous shibboleths that I'm going to have to make to have this conversation.
Yeah.
I feel, perhaps incorrectly, I might add, that I'm untroubled by any of those things. So I can see something that you can't see because
Yeah.
you are stuck inside a system
Yeah.
of beliefs that traps you. And so I was talking with this guy, and I eventually got him to, he was trying to convert me to Scientology, obviously. And I wondered, where do you live? What does this guy do for a job? So I started to quiz him about this. What do you do for work? And he said, oh, I work for the church. And I said, that's interesting. And you can see where my mind was going with this now. And I said, so how does that work then? How does it come to be that you work for the church? And he explained. And I said, so where do you live? And he says, I live in the church. And I say, so you don't have your own place? Do they not pay you enough? Do you want to get your own place? This kind of a thing. No. I'm quite happy to live inside the church. I said, do you have your own room? And it was, I think he explained he lived in bunks. And obviously the answer to each question that he's answering is presenting a picture to me,
Right.
which is, here is a person inside an information ecosystem that he cannot see.
Right.
And the picture I'm seeing is, here's a person being exploited by the church. And because I'm not inside the church, I can see that.
Yeah.
And no attempt on my part to get him to not even recognize this, but to see those points in the story that paint that picture. He couldn't do it. It didn't matter what I said. It doesn't matter how I present his own situation back to him. That is what he will see. Now, that is a very nuts and bolts version of the kind of thing that it particularly interests me. And it gets more and more ambiguous the more and more complex these ideas get.
Yeah.
But you find yourself in situations where people wed themselves, me included. Like, I'm not free from this by any means. They wed themselves to a particular idea, and no amount of demonstrating the fundamental flaws inside those positions, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. So and then that leads to a practical question for people like yourself and me, and why I write and why you write. Why do we do any of these things? A particular obsession of mine is, I consider myself like an intellectual lockpicker. That's way too self-aggrandizing. I'm curious to know if there's a route through. I'm always thinking, is there another way that I can explain this? Is there another way that I can make a metaphor about this? Is there another perspective I can create where people might go, oh, I'd never seen or thought about it that way. And I'm always interested to provoke and prod in those ways to see if I can get that breakthrough. And if you turn the lens back on yourself and do that, so you are the subject of that process, it's quite a troubling and difficult thing. It's actually a really awful thing to go through.
So a couple thoughts there. One, this is going to sound funny. So I really got heavily. I sort of started going deep down the intellectual investigation side of things at 16. I read a book by Thomas Sowell, who's still my favorite author. And he used the term intellectuals in not a very positive light, I might say. But the way he was talking about it, people whose main product professionally and maybe even in their life is ideas. And I thought, okay, that's me. I'm going to do that. And kind of, go down the rabbit hole here. And he's very pessimistic about the caliber of intellectuals that we have at present. I am even more so, I think, than definitely more so than he is. But I also, at some point, I read Meditations on First Philosophy by Descartes. And this is a wonderful little book. And part of the book is he essentially says, I have realized that all of my previous beliefs were sort of trust, let's say, just in our language, like I was just trusting that people were correct about things and they turn out not to be correct. So like, what can I know about anything? Can I have certainty about anything? Can I have access to the truth myself? Or is this all just a social thing? And he came to the conclusion that there's a limited set of ideas you can actually know. And I agree with him on this conclusion. In fact, I wrote a short book called Square One: The Foundations of Knowledge, which is my own little Cartesian investigation here of saying we can know a certain number of abstract truths. Doesn't matter the social dimensions at all. You have access to truth in this way, in a very limited way. But anyway, in here, and there was also a thing Descartes wrote. It was called I forget the title of it, but it's about his methodology, where he's sort of explaining how he thinks about things, and he just sort of didn't seem to have any issue with this idea of, well, I'm just going to throw out all my beliefs and start from scratch. And I know for most people, that sounds totally crazy. Like, how could you possibly do that? And practically speaking, you can't, right? You can't be like, well, maybe the chair doesn't exist under me. And like, maybe I don't need to eat food. You can't, like, you can't really examine all of these things. But at a normal, intuitive level, you just go, oh, yeah, I guess maybe I was wrong about everything. I'm sort of on my own. I just got to build from scratch. And for whatever reason, that just seemed like, oh, yeah, that's what I got to do. I didn't have, that you were talking about the turning the lockpick on
Yep.
yourself. I did that. And I was like, oh, I'm totally full of shit. I have no idea what I'm talking about or anything. I got to do my own. I got to figure out my own thing. I'm on my own path. I see the appeals to authority everywhere. I was doing it. So I'm just going to kind of start over. And
Yeah.
I feel like that worked. I know a lot of people think maybe that's a very bad approach, and maybe it's because they don't feel like they can have access to truth, and so they have no foundation under them. But I felt like, no, you can actually build up and make progress here.
I admire you for that, because I haven't done that. I think if I threw everything out, I'm taking a more kind of a grazing approach. I have this strategy of I'm aware there are certain rocks I should overturn and look underneath, but I know that I'm not quite ready to find out what's underneath there. And a big component of that is social. These ideas, whilst they're interesting, they are antisocial ideas.
Yeah, I guess you could say that.
They get people's backs up, me included. The subject matter that I write about on The Digger is extremely challenging. I don't like to even talk about it or write about it. I find that what tends to happen is almost like you're lost at sea. Yeah. If you were lost at sea and you saw another person lost at sea, it's like the most huge elation ever. Oh my goodness, there's somebody else who's felt and seen this. And what I find is that when I speak to people in this realm, there's this huge cathartic explosion of like, my goodness, how long have you been lost at sea? And who wants to be lost at sea? It's awful. And again, I fear, as I say that, it sounds so self-aggrandizing. So my strategy for these kinds of things is broadly to never really talk about it outside of my work. Because if I'm down the pub, talking to some friends, talking to my family, how are you going to get there? Because what you're saying is, broadly, if you want to have these super interesting conversations about, the foundations upon which we base all of our decisions and knowledge is actually crumbling away, and people don't want to know. And not only do they not want to know, I don't resent them for that at all. It's like it's a form of bizarre self-flagellation to constantly reassess and think, what am I going to learn about next? And it's unnerving, and I don't know, it's gross. And there's this example. I don't know if you've read that book called Nothing to Envy. Have you read this?
No.
It's a fantastic book about people who escaped from North Korea. So it's a fairly extreme example. There's an incredible piece in this book where, excuse me, in North Korea, if your television breaks, you can't fix it yourself. In fact, if anything breaks, you can't fix it yourself. Everything is done by the government, everything. So if your television breaks, you're supposed to contact the authorities. They'll come and they'll fix it for you. And it's strictly forbidden for you to try and do that yourself. But of course, because everything is so dysfunctional in that nation, it might be weeks, months, maybe your TV will never get fixed. So there's a story this guy tells, and it's told in the first person. And his TV breaks, and weeks go by, it doesn't get fixed. And he eventually thinks, you know what, like, I'll fix this thing myself. And he does that because it fell off the table when it broke. That's how it broke, right? And it cracked open the side of the television and revealed this dial, which over the weeks of thinking about how the TV is broken, He thinks maybe this dial here is why it's not broken. And so one day, with his heart pounding, indoctrinated to know that messing with any of this stuff carries punishment, he moves the dial and he realizes that there's 4 pieces of metal on this dial. Now you can imagine that the old school tuning dials, if you turn it, the frequency shifts. Those pieces of metals, they're like a piece of a pin that locks the frequency in to the North Korean channels. This is why they don't let you fix that TV yourself. And he thinks, oh, if I move it back to where it intuitively looks like it should be, I'll fix it. And as he's moving this dial with no idea what this dial even does, he's changing the frequency on the TV. And there, in the middle of the night, South Korean television switches on. Can you imagine that moment? What
crazy.
That's like? And the first thing he thinks is, my goodness, everybody in South Korea is fat. Because because he's looking
Probably
around.
as a good thing, right?
Yeah, of course. Because he's looking around to where he lives, and he has this unrenewable realization that we're all skinny. Why is everybody in South Korea fat? How can that possibly be? Because I've been told X and Y and Z. And it's the most beautiful exploration of what ontological shock actually is, because it's a unique historical example that the overwhelming nonsense that someone's been indoctrinated with, to the point that it's kind of satirical, the amount of nonsense they're fed, suddenly in one really trivial moment unlocks. And that process is very difficult for people to go through. It's not easy. And it meant that he had to risk his life to leave North Korea. He cannot continue to live in that society. He becomes, against his own wishes, a pariah in that society. Now, again, for the fear of sounding self-aggrandizing, there's an element of that at play with all of these things. And these myths form a big part of what society even is.
Right.
And so even if you're right about it, or people suspect you might be right about it, they don't want that shaken. And I don't know whether that's a conscious thing or a subconscious thing, but there's a fear of like, don't, because I don't know what's on the other side of that. So just leave it, please.
Yeah, fascinating example. A couple thoughts here. So I have long abandoned the concern of sounding arrogant and self-aggrandizing. So I'll just blast into it, right? I will say, though, my decision to just be like, oh, yeah, I guess I don't know anything. Maybe I should start from scratch. That was done out of stupidity and naivete. And I think the reason, actually, now that I'm sort of introspecting back on, history, my mother was both my parents were very religious, but my mother had this idea that, like, truth is always good. It's just self-evidently obvious that the truth is good and it's on your side. She was a Christian. She had an association with truth and Christ and love and goodness. And so it just seemed like, oh, yeah, well, truth is the thing that matters. And so I'm obviously wrong about a bunch of stuff. So I'm just going to blast into this. Since then, I have realized much of what you're saying. And in fact, it took me way too long to figure this out. The stupidity and the naivete lasted until, in fact, I think it was 28. And I came across a video of some guy who has a very weird philosophy, very pessimistic, nihilistic philosophy, who I guess has compassion for people who are like on the autistic spectrum or something. Because he said, listen, this is what you need to know about the video was something like why people open their mouths. And I had just been operating under this assumption implicitly that, like, when people are talking, they're trying to exchange information that has some connection with truth. And I mean, this was 5 years ago I found this video, and I was like, oh, this actually explains a whole lot of stuff that I was missing. He was saying, look, no, that they don't really do that. That is very much the exception. What people are doing is a social thing. They're trying to gain status points. They're trying to say, I'm a member of this team. I'm on the in group. You're on the out group. I have some dominance or power over you. And it doesn't really, truth is like not something that people care that much about and they're very threatened by. I thought, oh, that explains so much that I should have understood many years ago. But even then, so I figured that out a few years ago, and I'm like, okay, right. Most people don't care about truth. And there's lots of reasons for that. I don't want to be looking down my nose. It's that this philosophy is destabilizing. If you are not confident in your ability to discern really abstract truths from really abstract falsehoods, philosophy will mess with your mind. Like philosophy proper, too. I'm talking the study of metaphysics, epistemology, and logic. Some of these concepts of what is a mind, what is a self. You and I have an intuitive idea of what these things are, but when we analytically break them apart, if we do so frivolously, you might damage yourself, frankly, because they're really hard concepts. I don't have any of the, I don't have this stuff sorted out. It's really, really hard. There's a reason this has been, a domain of inquiry for thousands of years, and it's hard to make progress because it's really hard, and it's not just destabilizing for the individual, or can be.
Yeah.
It is for the group, for society,
Yeah.
and especially for political structures.
100%. And
Yeah.
I share with your mother a keen desire to get toward the truth until very recently. I think until maybe this year, for the first time, I started to wonder, actually, how valuable is the truth? And now me saying that out loud requires so much of my audience to understand why I hold that view, because I don't want people to think that I therefore want to make stuff up. I don't.
Right.
But in a really odd way, it's a very difficult thing to talk about, because you come to a stage where, for reasons that should be obvious, you find things that aren't true in society, and there's no reason to shine light on what those things are, and you find out those things are not true.
Yeah.
And then you think, and I know why the perception of that has to remain like that. And we have to leave the story there. I don't think there's anywhere else to go on that, because it's a pointless road to wander down. And it does leave you in a strange situation.
Can you give me an example of that?
No, exactly. I cannot, and I don't want to.
Okay.
I know the examples, but I don't want to go there, because it's almost at this point in my life, I'm like, I actually respect the myth. We learned at university about the idea of mythology, and I was very resistant to it at the time. This idea that we live in a society full of mythology. And it was my desire to get to the truth that was so instinctively ingrained against that. How can we have a society where mythology has to be a part of it? People ought to be trusted with the truth. It's the old line from A Few Good Men, right? I don't even know if I've seen the movie, but
I haven't either, but I know the quote.
I know the line, "You can't handle the truth." I'm at the point where I'm sympathetic to this view. And the next, and again, I know how frustrating this is for the audience, because they're going to be thinking, what do you mean? Give us some examples. We could maybe make up a theoretical nonsense example. Let's see if we can do that. It's difficult to think up politically correct ones. Okay, let's say that someone was injured in a car accident, right? And they are disabled to the tune of, say, 65%. And it's just, they're going to be stuck in a wheelchair, and that's that. The truth is, they can't do a whole range of stuff, but they can't come to know that. They actually, because they will lead a better life and have a more positive outlook if they don't fully integrate their situation. They have to take on a new thing.
Why do you believe that?
Well, because it's funny, because we spoke earlier about my faith. I don't have a religion, and I railed against the idea of faith in the Christian tradition for years, because I thought, okay, you have knowledge progresses, and then you're asking me to believe in this thing called God, and I'm going to have a conversation with this thing called God, and so on. But my belief that God is real is not there. And Christians, by and large, when I spoke with them, were like, but you have to have faith. And I said, well, this is just a bandage, because I don't have faith, because I need to know for sure that is there. There's this bandage that you can place on that, which is you actually just have to have faith. And it's in a super ambiguous term. If someone fully acknowledges the tragedy of their position, if an objective truth could be found about that, let's say, like we've used in our example, you are 65% disabled. The reason I use that is because, as a very quick aside, that's the number that's required to get a vaccine damage payout in the UK legal system. You have to prove legally that, I think it's 60%. I've been 60% disabled. What a curious and bizarre and irrational.
What does that mean?
Exactly.
What is the quantity unit? What are the units? A
So
percentage disabled? Okay.
it's stupid, but you have to then acknowledge a sort of tragic situation and
Yeah.
integrate it into your life. But you would be much better served to not. So in the medical field, sometimes people will say you can accept the diagnosis, but don't accept the prognosis. And this
Hmm.
is broadly this idea of faith, that even if it's objectively true, it might not be in your best interest to integrate that. It might be in your best interest to remodel that truth internally and say, I know that you told me I'm 65% disabled, and maybe that's objectively true, but I think I can get up to the top of the mountain. I think that I can ski. And in these crazy situations, then that happens. People suddenly can take on whole new lives. And then at that point, in the philosophical argument, people would say, oh, well, we just reworked what the truth is. We just move it to 30% disabled. That's all it was. We thought it was 65, and so we just remodel it down. But the things that we know and believe in our minds and in our hearts become a kind of a truth.
Okay, hang on. I got
right?
There's too much here. I gotta jump in. Okay. I think you've contradicted yourself though, because the example you've given is somebody who doesn't integrate the truth that they're 65% disabled, and it turns out that they're 35% disabled. Well, wouldn't it have been a tragedy to integrate such a falsehood? So what you're really saying is it would be bad for people to believe things that aren't true. And the truth of the matter is that the experts who are diagnosing you 65% disabled in that circumstance would be wrong. So I'm going to take the opposite approach here. I'm going to say we can handle the truth, actually. There are like crazy, difficult, painful, soul crushing truths out there, like really, really bad ones. And it's okay. You really can see the truth for what it is. You can feel the pain. And it is better to live that life. And I think empirically speaking, too, I don't think it serves a disabled person to lie to themselves that they're not disabled. I think they're going to be able to have a more maximally fulfilling life to say, here are my actual limitations. First of all, I have no reason to trust the expert, because the amount of stories of people having doctors tell them you're terminally ill, that you're never going to get better, you're never going to walk again, it's endless. So that's
You're describing faith. You're describing faith because if you get told something, it doesn't really matter what someone says. It's like,
not faith.
Go on.
It's knowledge.
It's curious to me that
it's knowledge in the fallibility of man. And now it's a whole bunch of actual like formal research I've been doing about the experts who are wrong about everything. It's not faith in anything. It's just like, no, we don't know how the world works. We don't. Let me give you a few examples. Up until fairly recently, it was believed that different critical organs in the body were sterile. And the reason that they believed this is because they didn't have the instruments and the tools to know, they didn't have powerful enough microscopes, let's say, to discover that there is nothing in the body that is sterile. The brain has a microbiome. Your lungs have a microbiome. Everything has a microbiome. But we thought that they were sterile because the early like 18th century thinkers looked with their primitive technology, they didn't find it. They said, I guess the organs are sterile. And therefore, if we find a bacteria that's there, it must be reflective of some inherently bad state because there shouldn't be any bacteria there. Well, it turns out that that's the completely incorrect position. Now, I could give many such examples where I have overwhelming evidence that people really don't know how the world works. And so I don't think it's faith understood as like, I'm going to lie to myself. If you want to use the word faith, it's just sort of like a belief based on evidence and reason that even in the midst of really bad circumstances, there can be a good thing. There can be a life worth living. Is that faith? I mean, if you want to call it that, I just think it's how the world works.
I mean, it's an attempt to be positive in the face of overwhelming.
Yeah, but for reason, because it makes sense, not because you lie to yourself, but because, like, no, you really can. I mean, this is what you were talking about Christianity. Like, this is the Christian story. You've got the story of the man fully accepting truth and the consequence of speaking the truth is the religious authorities give him over to the political authorities to torture him to death, and he accepts it. And from that, in the Christian story, you get you get the world changing event of Christ's crucifixion, and people saying maybe truth actually does matter. Maybe this is a story about love, and like, look at this guy went through the fire all the way to death, and now like our Western civilization is built on this story. This is a very, yes, technically it's myth. I mean, it's mythology, but
Yes.
there's a whole bunch of truths that are there. I mean, don't get me wrong. I'm not one of the people that believes that Jesus like didn't exist. I'm just saying, packed into what Christianity is, there's a whole bunch of mythology, but it's based, in my opinion, in truth, in
Let
like
me
real truth. Yeah.
Let's try another one. Because
Yeah.
I don't
Okay.
think my example was a good
Okay.
example,
Go
and
for it.
it's so hard to come up with examples that aren't upsetting or stupid or
Yeah.
like. Let's
No problem.
let's go with some gorillas in a zoo.
Okay.
Okay. Now those gorillas in a zoo, arguably, for the sake of argument, let's say that they're not really capable of understanding the complexity of their situation.
Okay.
And so they live in a kind of quasi-truth, which is we get fed every day. I'm quite happy. I've got my partner here. We've got a troop of gorillas, some children. And maybe they can find some contentness and happiness in that, right? Now imagine one of the gorillas in this absurd example starts to nag the rest of the troop of gorillas to say, you know what, guys, this is a zoo. And they're like, well, what's a zoo? And he's saying, like, our cousins, you're a gorilla, and the gorilla's like, what? You're a gorilla, and in the rest of the world, and they're like, what's the rest of the world? In the rest of the world, you live somewhere different. You live in the jungle. What's a jungle? And he's constantly chipping away at the edifice of their existence, which is keeping them very content. They will shun that gorilla in this thought experiment. They'll say, I actually don't want to know, because if I know, if I come to learn that I am stuck inside this fake crafted environment that's been designed to placate me and put me on display of these paying great white apes, and then I'll be very sad about that. So don't reveal my reality to me, because to do so will make me sad, and it would live the rest of its life, 50 years, 40 years, in a tragedy because it won't get out.
Yeah, this reminds me. The Matrix is like one of my favorite movies, right? There's you're talking about the character Cypher.
Right, exactly. I was going to use that example, but I thought I'd go with a more stupid version of the gorilla.
You're right. Cypher is eating this steak, and he's like, "Oh, it's delicious. I know this is an illusion. I know it's all fake, but I don't care. Just give me, just give me the illusion." And it's very, very deep concept, but it's hard to do the gorilla thing, because baked into that is this idea of the limitations on understanding. And so you'd say, well, here, maybe we could say this. This is something I'm thinking a lot about. I'm going to quote my mother again. So my mother and I would have discussions about religion, and I also had very high needs for epistemic standards. And she said, Steve, not everybody needs what you need. And that phrase has always stuck with me. Not everybody needs what you need. So it could be, I think this is the world that we live in, that some people are actually going to live more miserable lives I think I swore once on the podcast. Can I swear again lightly? Is that no good?
You can swear.
Okay.
It doesn't bother me.
Okay. I think half-assing the pursuit of truth is a way to misery. And I think it's also a way to confusion. So like if somebody is very busy with their time and they're interested in philosophy, and they're like, you know what I'm going to do? I'm just going to dive deep into the philosophy of mind, the philosophy of self. Do I exist at all? Do objects exist at all that are outside of my mind? It's very, very likely in my mind that they're going to harm themselves, because in order to do justice to some of these ideas, it takes a great deal of effort and time, and it's not something I would recommend. If you've got to work 8 hours a day in a normal job, like this might mess with you. You might be a lot less productive. Though at the end of the day, if you can do it the right way and you have the environmental circumstances that are conducive to it, I do believe that this is a very important and interesting examination, so long as you don't half-ass it. So I think this is sort of the idea as well, that if you're in a circumstance where you're like, I sort of get the impression that the truth is terrifying and destabilizing, I'm not in a position to say, try despite that, because your circumstances might not be conducive to that. It might not be good for you. But I do think behind that, There are some people who have the circumstances and the weird psychology and whatever where you can handle the truth, and it's important to and that is actually your way. It is better to be a miserable ape than
Yeah.
to be the one that's like, no, I'm just gonna believe the lie.
Well, we could continue the ape idea, because what if the ape in this example thinks, if I can get the rest of these guys to understand this,
Yeah,
maybe we can get out.
yeah.
And imagine there's some plan that he's hatched. Once they understand this situation, we can get out and we can get to the jungle, right? Then it changes course, because then you think it's at this point, even though the escape strategy is narrow, there is a promised land on the other side.
Or sorry, I just gotta say, or the guy goes, you know what? Zoos are awesome. He thinks about, oh, my aunts, my cousins out there in the jungle, those are miserable lives. I get my butt wiped by these people. I get 3 fresh meals a day. I get my partners put in there. This is great. All right, give me. That's also a possibility. I don't want to speak on behalf of the apes.
Yeah, that's spin, not truth. That's editorial. That's like reinterpreting the literature to see some story that isn't really there. One place where it becomes acutely important, this is the thing, because in the abstract concepts, it's like, okay, well, this might make me question my own sense of self. And again, these hypotheticals, I have fears now that the medical advice that people receive in very serious conditions might not be the best. And I also have fears that their belief that the advice they receive is good advice has material impacts, and it then doesn't become philosophical or analytical or theoretical or any of those things. And then from that place, I become like that Scientology guy that I spoke to you about earlier.
Yeah.
I'm now stuck inside my own hall of mirrors, and I have to have the confidence in my position to go out and dislodge somebody else's, because if I think that what you're about to do is harmful to yourself, to your family, and I'm confident enough in my own position, do I make an intervention and say, but then once I've done that, what if I convince that person that I'm right and they change course? And then they damage and hurt themselves.
Okay, so like, geez, this is our real light questions here on this first interview. Like, this is like
riddle me that one, Steve.
Yeah, wow, that is not a problem I have a solution to. Let me make it harder, just because I have personal experience here. I have a friend who knows I've been doing a lot of medical research for the past many years, because my wife and I have had some medical issues and have dived very deeply into a bunch of different literature, and we have a very good model, I think, for, let's say, chronic illness. This gentleman is a friend. He's very bright. He's got a lot of time to do his own research. And anyway, I've tried to explain to him what I think you're dealing with is very complex, and it's very hard. And it's going to be harder than your average doc is going to be able to handle, like way harder, because your average doc does not read a bunch of scientific literature and understand where some good research is. Most of the scientific literature is fine if you don't read, because I think it's poor quality anyway, but there are some pockets of excellence here and there that would be great for people to read, but they don't. So you either need to find a real specialist to take care of this, in my opinion, or I will try to articulate what I think is going on. I know this sounds preposterous for somebody in my position to play doctor, but trust me, there's a lot of caveats, like, please understand, this is really complex. You got to be super careful here. Anyway, I do my best to explain what I think is going on, and I think in hindsight, I think it's correct. But I got several data points from this very bright, motivated individual that I don't think he harmed himself or anything, but there's a bunch of nuance in this explanation I'm trying to give him, and he didn't pick up on any of the nuance. I'm saying, and I'm trying to say in big highlighted letters, I'm trying to say X, don't take this as Y, and he takes it as Y. Now, that could result, not in this case, it didn't result in somebody harming themselves, but especially when you're talking about medical issues, that can result in harm that otherwise wouldn't have been there. So this is like a very live issue, especially for somebody like myself, who a lot of the dissident research I'm doing is in the medical domain. I don't know how to communicate some of these concepts to somebody, even if you put a lot of work in trying to make complex things simple, and you try to give the correct nuance, and maybe you feel like, oh, this is really well written or whatever, there's a problem here, which is in this domain, due to the complexity problem, people are going to take your really good ideas and end up harming themselves one way or another. I don't know how to deal with that. It's very, very, very hard.
I don't know either. And I think when you try and solve it, you actually can shine some light on how we ended up in this situation in the first place.
Yeah.
It's like the bystander problem, which is very well documented, of broadly people don't intervene. And so if you had an antisocial actor in a scenario, I mean, a literal person doing something, they can exploit this uncertainty. They will recognize that people are not sure what the answer is here. And I can march in very confidently and say, it's this. And that might benefit that person or that institution or that corporation. And I think the pharmaceutical industry does this all the time. They trade, I believe that so much of modern medicine trades in fear. And it talks, even when it's talking about things in a very sort of fluffy language of like, oh, you should go and get screened. This kind of a thing, right? There's a very subtle underlying tone of fear in all of it, which is like, what if I have got X and Y and Z? What if it's this? What if it's that? And then running alongside it, there's all of these solutions. And us filled with doubt, certainly myself, like that I can't possibly know. And I can only really tell you, my intuition is there's something wrong here. And in very concrete cases here and there, but not across the whole broad spectrum of medicine. But I will demonstrate to you, if you have the time, some concrete examples of where this very odd gravitational force enters modern medical literature, and it warps it in ways that's particularly useful and profitable for it. I'll show that to you. But for everything else, I can't keep up. It's a war of attrition. And my uncertainty means that broadly my strategy is, well, hopefully they know what they're doing and what they're talking about. And I think you could probably trace dozens of historical crimes to this ambivalence, which is basically like, I don't know. What am I supposed to do,
Slightly different take here is I think we are hitting on the reason why expertise is a thing functionally in society. Due to the complexity problem, it is ridiculous to imagine that people who have medical issues are going to be like, well, let me read 600 scientific papers and make up my own opinion. That's just crazy. You have to have experts. The problem is, what happens if the experts are incompetent? Right? What happens when the experts get off track and they're not actually experts? Then you have an enormous societal problem, which I think that is the problem that we've been in for quite some time. But also, this is where I don't know how familiar. It sounded like you were familiar with Thomas Sowell's work.
Well, it's interesting that you said that because, again, so much has happened to me politically over the last 4 years. I ended up reading Thomas Sowell in a kind of rage quit kind of a manner. I ended up seeing some of his videos on YouTube from the 1970s.
Glorious.
And I thought, who the hell is this guy? I don't understand how he can be, the way he looked, the way he spoke. My map of who a person like that ought to be didn't wash with what was being said. And it kind of rubbed me up the wrong way. And there was all this kind of like strife going on at the time with that, with identity politics and whatnot. And broadly, Thomas Sowell completely wound me up a huge amount. And I thought, you know what? Let's listen to what this guy says. I'll read it purely because I thought, it's like the equivalent of reading George Bush in like 2001 or something. And I read Discrimination and Discrepancies, I believe.
Newer one.
And it basically turned my world upside down. And that was the...
Really?
Yeah, 100% it turned my world upside down.
I'm sorry, my reaction is only because he's got better. You got to read Intellectuals in Society. It's so good. You got to read The Conflict Division. Okay, one of the best books written on political and social philosophy is called The Conflict Divisions. It's an old classic by Tom Sowell. It is brilliant. In my mind, he's the best American thinker that maybe we've ever produced. I don't know, best American thinker in the last century, but maybe ever. I could rave about him. So my shock was just like, oh, that was the book they got you. I think he's the best writer as well. The writing style. Immaculate.
Well, remember when I said...
I'm such a fanboy, I can't stop.
Same. I've tried to get friends to read his book, and I think that what tends to happen is... Because I'm I'm politically on the left, if you can believe it. I used to campaign for Jeremy Corbyn way back when. So
Hmm.
I've arrived into this space because the politics of all of this is quite interesting to me. People often assume whenever you speak about any of these things that you're right wing or hyper right wing or like some nationalist or something like this. Was traditionally left of center. I've moved much closer. I would consider myself a centrist now.
Hmm.
And it was Soul that dragged me there because broadly what I took from Soul was whatever it is you think you know, you probably don't know. And have you ever really
Yeah.
tested it? And have you ever really looked? And do you think those ideas that you think are true and hope are true and would love to be true are actually true? Because when we test those ideas,
Right.
they're probably wrong. And I remember I said that I have this thing where I know if I pick up a rock and look underneath, I don't want to know what I'm going to find under there. Like
Mm.
having read Discrimination and Disparities by Saul, I'm thinking I'm not sure I want to read any more of his books because
Oh, it's so good. I'm just absolutely. So I have been blessed to be able to meet a lot of my idols, and I have tried to get a hold of Soul. He's like the last on my list of people that I just idolize.
he's
And I did
93
funny
now, is
story.
he? He's
Yeah, he's
very.
in his 90s.
Mm.
Yeah, I did through clever means. I was able to get his email, and I was just telling my wife about this the other day. I really have my fanboying under control, except for Thomas Sowell, because I sent him an email trying to get him on my show, which is I compare. He talks at the highest level. There's no chance the dude's going to talk to me on my little show. But anyway, he did write back, and he referred me to his assistant. But it's funny because here's the guy who's like my idol, and it's this like one sentence. There's like multiple basic typos in it. He just didn't
Yeah.
care. He's writing it, thank you for your message. And I'm like, oh my God,
One,
this is just so funny. The
one
dude,
finger typing.
exactly. He's probably going through 1,000 emails a day, but sure enough, I've got his message in my inbox and I'm like, yes, this is the message I will never delete. Anyway, I brought up Soul because we were talking about expertise. And when you go down the Soul bandwagon, and then I've sort of expanded Soul's take into a bunch of different domains, it's very hard not to be like bitter and jaded towards even the pompous idea of the experts have an opinion and that opinion is likely true. But as we just discussed, there's no way to get rid of expertise in society and everybody self-educate about everything. That's actually impossible. So I think what maybe we're in the middle of is some sort of restructuring
Mm.
of maybe social hierarchies, or universities isn't quite the way to think about it, because the good ideas I don't think are coming out of the universities. We're seeing a new emergence, I think, of different intellectuals that maybe were silenced in the old system that are now becoming the experts and the authorities. That
Yep.
it's not a perfect system, and it's kind of tragic that we're just going to be reinventing the wheel here, and those social dynamics aren't going away. But I do think this is a way kind of that society has of correcting from mass institutional and expertise failure. Is you just have a new group
I
that has
agree.
different paradigms and different informational structures, and eventually that's going to get corrupted too. But in the meantime, we probably need them.
Yeah, I agree. It's like the Reformation of the church in a way. I think that
Yes.
we're at this point of people are feeling more comfortable to say the emperor has no clothes.
Yes.
And your article really spoke to that actually, which is, maybe that's true in cosmology. Maybe that, I mean, here's a crazy one. And I don't know how my audience would ever respond to this. I haven't written about this on the Digger. Years ago for Truth Loader, I used to be super interested by UFOs. All my life,
Yep.
in fact, when I was like 10 years old, I started a UFO club with my friend, and we used to sit in his loft and with binoculars each night and see if we could find UFOs my whole life. So it was completely natural to me to follow the subject. And I watched it change morph. Like if I spoke to anyone when I was 12, they were like, UFOs.
Yes. Great example.
15, UFOs. 18, UFOs. Phil believes in aliens, this, that kind of a thing. To see this subject matter online, where very serious thinkers that I'm fans of suddenly thinking, "Oh, I better get my ducks in a row about what my opinion is on this subject matter." Suddenly, it's become, we need to talk about this. If that is not a bigger demonstration of
Yes.
the flux that we are in, that a subject as radioactive as ufology is suddenly online. We've got Gary Nolan, a Nobel
Not just
scientists.
online. I've seen this discussed on like mainstream news platforms. They're
Yeah,
talking about that they've covered some UFO concepts, which was
but
inconceivable 10 years ago, 15 years ago.
I agree. It still carries with it some of this kind of like, and now shiny beacon in the sky, filmed by Channel 9. It still
Oh
carries
no,
some.
no.
It's still there, some a little bit.
Maybe in some of them, I've seen news coverage of. I don't mean like an event that has taken place. I mean like, when the Tic Tac video came out,
Yeah,
there was a bunch of they would bring on military experts to give their trite little opinion. It wasn't like the live scene of the blurry image that we speculate is that is out there. But I'm just saying I've seen like people who would self-select as being official, the part of the officialdom, have taken positions on the fact that UFOs are a thing. Strictly speaking, there are these unidentified aerial phenomena that we don't have a
yeah.
great understanding of.
And Neil deGrasse Tyson is a fantastic example of what I'm talking about. He made his bed far, far, far too early. We're talking in an age of YouTube when he blew up as an intellectual. People liked him. He's a charismatic guy. I get it. I met him once, so I don't want to. He is what he is, right? He's a person who wants to tell you the science about
Yeah.
space and whatnot.
Right.
He spoke for years before this thing online about how completely, and look, he's kind of backed himself into a corner now. And I think a lot of intellectuals would look at that and think it's probably best if I'm not sure about the latest weird thing that's appearing in my newsfeed that I just don't say anything about it at all, and I'll let some people who dare to get themselves into that arena hash this thing out. But Neil
Okay.
deGrasse Tyson has made himself, how does he recover from that? Over on this side of the debate, there's a guy called Professor Brian Cox, and he's the UK equivalent of Neil deGrasse Tyson. Very, very well liked, nice guy, good educator, speaks very well. He's always at these big events talking about the importance of cosmology. His position's under some question marks because of what Eric Lerner has said about the Big Bang and whatnot. And this James Webb Telescope bringing in this data that is very much putting some question marks over the broad cosmological picture. And then this UFO thing's happening. Professor Brian Cox has been much more open to discussing it, but he still takes this very strident view that it couldn't possibly be, and this and that and the other. It's curious. Who knows where we escape from this? But for anyone who's looked at the subject matter, the idea that we can know, which is something our society definitely tilts towards wanting, because I believe we live in a culture, as I said at the beginning, that thinks it has the answers. It thinks it's rational and understands the world that it's living inside of. I'm not sure how close we're going to get to that with this subject matter. So I think, again, it makes people uncomfortable. Like, it's a new thing. What is it? And when the answer is, we're not sure, it makes people very uncomfortable.
Very much so. A few thoughts here. So I do want to loop back to one of the original questions that got us on this, which is, is it possible for the layman to do the research, to have an informed, reasonable opinion? I do want to come back to that because it's very important, especially in the times we live in. But on the idea of the new hierarchies that are emerging and this terrible difficulty of like, what do we do when the institutions fail? I think a few important things can be said. One is, if things go well and we continue to have the successful emergence of competent dissident voices, we are not, I hope, going into a world in which there is the new consensus of experts that X is true. Okay? If things go well, I think the world we're going into is competing schools of thought permanently. And the reason being what I call the complexity problem. The world is unbelievably complex. It's so complex, we don't know how complex it is. And the deeper you look, the more nuance and complexity there is. So I gave the example before of like, why do we even believe that organs were sterile? It's because we had low power microscopes, let's say. So the higher the power microscope, the more structure you're going to see. And if you think that, reality just so happens to be the exact resolution of my microscope in 2024, that's foolish. So whatever the grand theories that are going to emerge in 2024 with the tools that we have are going to be wrong, because we don't have tools to figure out the final truths in any time in the near future. So we're going to see competing schools of thought, and this is very important to understand, they're going to be in radical disagreement with one another about very important and fundamental things. Do we have the theory of Darwinian evolution sorted? No.
Goodness.
We have pieces of it, right? There are, I'm thinking about Brad Weinstein here, who's recently, gone through had a cycle where he's saying, well, I actually disagree on we need to change some concepts here and there. Okay. Do we have the final say on, have we figured out the final truth on, like, is there one paradigm of the philosophy of mathematics? It's something I've been researching a lot in the past many years. Have we sorted out, is it Zermelo-Fraenkel set theory? No. There are alternative paradigms that are completely incompatible with whatever you think is the existing paradigm or the orthodoxy. Completely incompatible, remain completely incompatible, indefinitely into the future, and that's as good as it can get. That's how good that would be a good scenario to say. You've got, for example, in medicine, you've got people who are they're trying the carnivore thing. These guys are the keto people. These people are doing the opposite. They're doing high carb. Yeah. These people think they've got the truth, and they're doing vegetarianism, fruitarianism. What we need to see is, what would be better is a plurality where you have all these different hierarchies, and they have their people who are really knowledgeable, and they're competing. I think if we see that, well, the dissident opinion is now the expert opinion of these officials is X, and therefore X is likely to be true, or like you're talking about cosmology. I don't know if this guy's like a steady state theorist or whatever, but he'd say, oh, it's steady state theory was actually turns out to be the truth. Yeah. Yeah. Let's try to avoid those scenarios. That should be a red flag. When people start talking, we now know this is a red flag, because of the complexity problem, we're going to end up with competing schools.
Of course, but the common thread is people are saying this thing that we're all holding on to, this thing is not the thing.
Yes, I totally agree with that. Yes.
And have you ever been to a festival? I use this analogy quite a lot. Have you ever been to a music festival? Or a gig?
I don't think so, actually.
Oh, no. Really? What about like a crazy party of any kind?
Sure, yeah.
So there's a period of the party, depending on how late you stay, right? Let's say it's like, for UK standards, let's say it's 3 a.m. to 5 a.m. In that period, confusion reigns. Because all of the fun and the energy and the sense happened before it. And then there's a strange cutoff point in the social endeavor where suddenly, and you couldn't put your finger on why, suddenly the party takes on a new feel, and you're like, whoa, it doesn't make sense anymore. I'm tired. People aren't making any sense to me. The conversations are not as interesting. I'm not sure how I'm getting home. I'm a bit cold. I feel, as an analogy, that's where our society is. We're in the 3 a.m. to 5 a.m. slot of a party. And suddenly the conversations people are having with each other are like, wait, what? What did you just say?
Yeah,
And it's all getting very, very confused. And normally what people tend to do at that moment is they go home, go to bed, get a good rest, wake up the next morning and say, man, I had some crazy conversations last night. It was a strange old party. And you try and integrate what happened in this big explosion of social activity.
Yeah.
It feels to me that's where we are. That's the analogy
really
I use.
Interesting take.
It's a weird, senseless place. And you can see it even on Twitter. You'll see people trying to integrate new things into the model of the world.
So this is what I see too, because you're talking about, we couldn't have talked about UFOs without being laughed at a few years ago. And now a lot of people are talking about it. I just see this as what it would look like were one to be coming to the end of a dark age, where whatever the expert consensus was, people are realizing, oh, that's not correct. And with COVID, there's so many notable dissidents on that. Well, that's not correct. I mean, you go through the list and I see evidence of a lot of people realizing maybe the paradigms we were living in are incorrect. Now, a couple more thoughts on that. One is, this has political consequences, unfortunately. Or maybe fortunately, I'm not sure, depending on whether you like the political structure that we're in right now. The reason it's unfortunate, at least, is because that makes it much harder to discern truth from falsehood. Because we have such a tight association of the intelligentsia and the state, and it just seems self-evident to us that, like, how should we govern our societies? Well, what do the experts say? What do the political scientists say should be done about X in the UK? Well, what should we do with climate change? Well, let's ask the climatologist what their position is. There is this incredibly deep connection. We think that it should be self-evident that the smart people should be the people in charge of our political structures. Well, one of the negative consequences of that is that the pursuit of truth becomes politicized. And so if you have this deep wedding of the intellectual class and the state, then when you start challenging the narrative and the paradigm, you're challenging the political structure. You're challenging, like we have this Tony Fauci character in the United
Yep.
States. I don't
Yeah,
know if
yeah,
you guys
yeah.
are aware of him. Okay.
Yep.
So people were like effectively worshiping him over here. He had like a cult around him. People were there were videos of people dancing in the streets with his image, like, oh, this is the guy who's gonna lead us out of the desert into the front.
Ouchie Fauci.
The Fauci ouchie. Yep. And there's a bunch of research and that this guy might be phenomenally corrupt. For multiple decades. That appears to be the case. So when we think maybe we could have a discussion about the safety of vaccines and medical policy and what is the standard of care in hospitals, you think this is an intellectual thing. Sorry, it's not just that. It seems to be dominated by political facts.
I agree.
So this is a huge problem that we face. It just inevitably, as we're seeing the emergence of more successful and vocal dissidents, it will have inevitable political consequences, and I don't really know what that looks like.
I totally agree. And for me, the strategy on that front is to depoliticize things. And for me, if there were practical advice I could give to myself and anyone who's interested in this, is number one, try to have deeper conversations with less people, and don't get a sense of your realm or your world via short form conversations online. Because primarily I thought at this point it's bought and influenced. But if you speak to people face to face, as you explained, the nuance of everything comes into focus. And because I'm perceived, I have a model of how I'm understood and how I really feel. And the two are always in tension. So with the political angle of this, people might think that I'm, as I said it before, that I'm right wing or that I'm a Christian, and then when they meet me and speak with me, they're like, whoa, he's like a left wing liberal. And all of it, the senselessness of the whole thing starts to emerge. It's like, actually, okay, let's just park all of that stuff because it's broadly just getting in the way. And we can now move on to Tony Fauci. Like you say, you can't demonstrate to people that Tony Fauci is a deeply problematic individual with a whole range of provable dodgy dealings under his belt, without politics being in the way. So what's our strategy going to have to be? Try as best you can to pick up the politics and throw it out the door.
Yeah, I mean, I'll give you my pessimistic take. I think this is like, maybe this could have been a strategy in 1960. I just think I don't think it's impossible. I don't think it's possible to get the politics, especially because the people, I'm speaking as an American, I'm going to say it's probably a safe bet. The U.S. government remains the most powerful government in the world.
Yeah, for now.
For now. The idea that like the biggest, most powerful, influential government in world history with nukes is going to be open to, I don't know, reevaluation of whether or not the people that populate it are incompetent or corrupt. I just don't see it happening.
That's not politics. I'm talking about people's personal politics. And you mentioned speaking as an American. So I think it'd be curious to get your take on this. Like, Britain is a political country and we are factionalized, but we have a two-party system broadly as well. It's Labour or the Tories. And our Tory party, which is the right-wing free market economic types, they would politically align kind of like with your left-wing party. I mean, they would probably be kind of like what the Democrats are. I know that some people will probably disagree with that. They've moved further and further to the right. None of this is particularly interesting to me. What's interesting to me is the factionalized thinking of the public, and how in a normal conversation you can disarm all of it.
I see. So you're saying like non-governmental politics.
I'm talking about interpersonal political viewpoints that preclude any further understanding of a subject on that particular person that you're talking with. It's the first roadblock to be picked up and moved. And it actually requires a bit of charisma and sass to do that. I feel once that is gone, much more progress can get made, because now we can have a conversation where it's like, it doesn't matter that the Trump supporters like this. It's not important right now. It doesn't matter that the Democrats like this. It doesn't matter that Hillary Clinton once read this book. Like,
Right.
leave it. Just put it down. Let's look at this, wholesale here.
My governmental political analysis then is the pessimistic one, where there's a lot of people, I see this in the States happening a lot. People are like, we're mad, and we're like, a lot of conservatives would be like, this is unacceptable. We're going to put our foot down. I just think, what's the analogy? There's there's a train, and it's already like blasted through a bunch of people's homes. Like, the tracks are going through people's houses. There are people in the houses. They're all smashed and slaughtered and broken up. And like 50 years later, some conservatives are finger wagging like, hey, this is unacceptable. And like, look, buddy, the thing has already done its damage. It's way down there, dude. You're talking about this is not going to make any difference. So I feel like, unfortunately, in my view, the American political game is throughout the world. I think we've got these very deep influences all throughout the world, and the truth is not on their side.
On America's side in general, you think?
Yes. Well, yes, generally. I mean, on government's side in general. I don't think this is uniquely American, but I suppose to the extent it's uniquely American, it's because of their unique power. So, like, I do think there tends to be an inverse relationship between political power and truth. So I think the American government is unbelievably corrupt. Mm-hmm. But anyway, I would just say, as a idle political commentary, that I don't see almost anybody proposing any type of solution of making the political situation better that I think is framed correctly. I mean, the only exceptions would be, there are some people who are like secessionists in the U.S. that think, they talk about a national divorce, that maybe we can have like the end of the Soviet Union, that collapsed into a bunch of different states. That was an improvement of things. That is the type of framing that gets me a little bit more excited, because I don't think persuasion is anywhere near the toolkit of, I don't think that's a tool we can use to persuade the people in political power in the U.S. to, like, shame them into releasing their power and giving it back to the public. I think we're way past that.
Yeah, I think it actually takes us onto the subject that we will be speaking about on another podcast soon to arrive at an unforeseen date, which is, let's construct an entirely new ecosystem, and then it doesn't really matter what happens to the previous one. And again, in this analogy, and I don't know the story brilliantly, but I've spoken to some Eastern Europeans. There's lots of Eastern Europeans in the UK and in Europe in general. In terms of government incursions in terms of government incursions into their life, or big bureaucratic incursions into their life, this is not their first rodeo.
Yeah, right.
So they've seen this before. They're way more skeptical about it than Western European people are, who broadly have a much more positive viewpoint about what government's role in society is. Right. Eastern Europeans are like, dudes, we've seen this. You be very careful with the language that they are using here. The reason I bring it up is I've heard a couple of people describe the collapse of the Soviet Union, and what was that like to live through that? Mm-hmm. A lot of people knew for years that the Soviet Union had collapsed, but they had a public life and a private life before the internet, and they had to continue to play this role, propping up this system, which in the Soviet Union's example is much more bureaucratic and government oriented than what I think is happening with us. But that tension between, I have to sort of believe my role in this society, I have to sort of perform my role in this society. There are certain things I will need to say. There are certain ways I will need to dress. There are certain ways I will need to talk and what I will need to do. And then privately having a deep skepticism that there's something deeply wrong. Eventually it manifests in reality. There's no way out, because it's like, okay, now I can't eat. Now I've sold my shoes for potatoes. Eventually, there's no further you can go, where your eyes eventually give in and say, look, this isn't working at all anymore. I believe the system that we've lived under, more in the informational sphere, and it's harder to pin down the center of gravity of what it is, because I don't think it's a government thing really. It's more of a sort of amorphous blob of things that make up our life day to day. It's so similar. I think there are now people going, this doesn't work. Loads of this doesn't make sense. It contradicts itself constantly.
Yes.
And those people are becoming emboldened, but there's still very, very many people who I think are now in that binary where they, like in the Soviet Union, they publicly say all the right things, but privately, I think we've got a huge number of people with deep skepticism.
I could give lots of anecdotal reinforcement of that. I definitely think that's the world we're living in, which is why I think the next big threat that we're all going to be facing, especially online, is censorship of free speech. Like, I think if the powers that be and the narrative controllers do not continue to control things, if they allow things as controlled as speech already is, there's too much for the system to continue indefinitely, in my opinion. So I am expecting we're going to see harder and harder clampdowns on free speech everywhere, because I do get the impression that the informational system is collapsing, or to some extent has already collapsed, because there's a bunch of people that are saying exactly what I just said, that they're already aware that the information controls are out there, that the narrative has been controlled already, and we're sort of predicting, they might go after Telegram or Twitter or whatever it is. So I very strongly agree with that sentiment. Okay, so I do want to. One more idea. I just want to bring it full circle here, and then maybe we can wrap up. I feel like you and I could do a 6-hour podcast here. This has been great.
Well, wouldn't that be self-aggrandizing?
Yes, no problem. So let's return to this question: is it possible for somebody who is a layman to educate themselves sufficiently where they could have a reasonable, informed opinion on complex issues from cosmology to medicine or whatever? The answer is yes, with big asterisks. So if you don't half-ass it, then it can be done. And there is a method for doing it correctly, in my opinion. And there's a sense in which it's a sophisticated method. There's another sense in which it's a completely unsophisticated method, which is read and listen to the thing that you're trying to learn about. And when you discover concepts or terms or phrases that you are unfamiliar with, then you familiarize yourself with them and you figure out, what does this mean? What does this mean? What does this mean? And you'll find it depends. It varies from domain to domain how much technical depth you have to go into in order to grasp the concepts of what's being spoken about. But I think it can be done. So here's this part of the changing information landscape. A few years ago, maybe 10 years ago, if you said, I've got these ideas about health that I got from, a YouTube, I got this eccentric guy on YouTube and he's saying all these crazy things, people would be like, well, that's totally nuts. Like, what do you think you're going to end up harming yourself? But today, I think it's very common. In fact, it's almost kind of taken for granted that people are getting a lot of interesting and often high quality information from places like YouTube, where it's all people are self-educating. Like, I remember when it was before carnivore, it was the paleo people in the nutrition world. There was a Mark Sisson was this big figure where there was, like, I don't know, nutritional dissidents who were saying maybe we should eat less carbs and like maybe less refined sugars and refined wheats and stuff. And that was a blog that was even before, it might have even been before YouTube, and it became like a social movement. And it gained so much success that it's kind of commonplace. If somebody says, "Oh, I'm doing low carb," nobody bats an eye. But I'm old enough to remember I didn't know anybody who was talking about low carb back in like 2000. That was like a thing. I'm sure it was out there, if somebody was really deep into it. But anyway, people have had great success and empirical success. The internet is filled with success stories of people turning their diets around, going along with what Mark Sisson had to say. He seemed to have a lot of correct ideas and like positively impacting their health because of it. So anyway, it can be done. And what I'm trying to do personally, if any of your audience is interested, I've been doing this type of research for many, many, many years now. And I discovered that I have too many examples of rabbit holes that need to be gone down. Like at some point, I have a list now of probably 150 different topics that are really interesting, really important, that we need fresh eyes to try to figure out the truth or falsity or plausibility or non-plausibility of different ideas. And so I have a list. I have like an Evernote file with the topic list is gigantic. And what I'm doing is I've made an institute called the Natural Philosophy Institute that's still private, so I haven't done any public research yet. And I'm putting together essentially a team. We're going to be AI assisted in our research to try to go down the rabbit hole and sort these things out. Like how this is let's say it's a lay research institute, but I think we're going to have great success. And on the topic of whether or not we're in a dark age, it's very hard to convince somebody of that at like an abstract theoretical level. It can be done. But the way that I'm going to be doing it is I'm going to be showing in domain after domain after domain after domain that in fact the orthodoxy is very likely to be incorrect. And if you listen to the dissidents, there's always excellent dissidents in all of these different domains that are making, plausible arguments for why the orthodoxy is wrong. If you listen to both sides, a lot of times, maybe even most of the time, dissidents tend to make better arguments than the orthodox people, but they just get silenced and mocked, and so their perspectives aren't heard. So when you see it in cosmology, and then you see it in medicine, and then you see it, we talk. Here's an interesting one, a rabbit hole to go down. I don't have an opinion on the truth of the matter, but there's a theory called the abiogenic origin of oil. I don't know if you've heard of this.
Yep.
There's an idea that maybe
just keeps coming, right?
Yeah, like maybe oil isn't even a fossil fuel that there's a finite supply of. Maybe this is produced deep in the Earth's core, or maybe not all the way in the core, but deep in the Earth's crust. This sounds like a totally wonky idea, but then you look into it and you go, no, actually, very serious people have been researching this for decades, many of them from Russia, because it's in their vested interest to examine these types of things. But there's a plausible story. I haven't gone down this rabbit hole to speak confidently, but I can say, no, that it might be that, in fact, the whole fossil fuel thing that we've been hearing, we're going to run out of fossil fuels, that might be just completely wrong, and there's effectively an endless supply.
Yeah. It's a fascinating discussion, Steve. It is. It's huge. And it's so strange that we've met in this way, because I agree with what you're saying broadly. I have an intuition that the more of this stuff you look at, you'll find the same pattern again and again.
Yeah.
And it's very much like that bit at the end of the Truman Show where he sails on his boat and then he has that juddering realization that his boat crashes into what he thinks is the rest of the world. And he's like, whoa, it's not even... What do you mean? Like, what? Imagine if we find this out. And again, like, I share with you the same thoughts. I don't know. I've heard people discussing it, but at this point, it just wouldn't surprise me to look at this. And it's curious that you're setting that institute up, because, as you know, or maybe you don't know, I don't know. I've set up that case.science tool, which is an AI-powered tool that almost exactly is attempting to address what you're describing, which is to say, if we can start to put together a body of literature for these cases that you're describing, hey, the oil actually might well just bubble up out of the ground. I'm not saying that's true or not. Please don't throw your phone out the window. We put that evidence base together in a place that people can engage with at their own pace and go through unperturbed by all of the censorship mechanisms that we're describing. Because, as you will know, but maybe not everybody does, Wikipedia is dead. It is a place of consensus. There's no way for you to find out anything on Wikipedia that isn't already in deep agreement. Okay, so if you want new information, what's the cool, interesting, hip, new stuff at the peripheries of our knowledge ecosystem? There's almost nowhere you can go. I really can't think of anywhere that you could feasibly go other than podcasts, YouTube, and as we've discussed and will be discussing in future podcasts, the censorship industrial complex, the misinformation industrial complex, things that are really starting to come into the focus for dissident voices. It's a very serious problem. Even the
Yeah.
people who know it's a problem, my view on it is they don't realize the scale of this problem.
Agreed.
However big you think this problem is, my intuition, based on the stuff that I've looked at and researched over the last 5 years, is the problem is way bigger. So we have to
Big
have
enough where I also feel like my explanation is, oh, what if we've actually been in a dark age? I try to
yeah,
take it to its extreme and say, well, that would explain the situation.
exactly. And I think that's why when you sent that to me, I thought, well, that chimes. It really does chime with what I've been reading and learning about. So we should work on that, because as you find that data, I think we should build those cases and the data sets into case and say, look, we can make this a repository of dissident information, because there's no other space you can do that as a reference. Because I've
Yeah,
heard people
yeah,
say, I'm going to Google that. And I'm thinking, the moment you Google that, it's finished. You won't get anywhere trying to Google that subject matter. You just won't. And unless
yeah.
they're people who are doing it full time for a job,
Right.
um, I don't think they stand a chance. So I don't quite share your optimism on the individuals can do this. I think people like you can do it. It's like
Well,
the argument that
yeah.
everybody could become like David Beckham, right?
Well, this is actually, I wanted to say, this sounds like where our projects might differ a little bit. Is the goal is for myself and a team to be doing all the heavy lifting and then writing articles to
Yep.
explain to the general public carefully and with citations that they can, if some handful of people want to actually do the heavy lifting themselves, they'll be able to look at that research that we've produced. And actually part of it, I haven't showed you, there's a cool back end for this thing I'm building out. There will be like essentially a comment section where researchers communicating with one another are going to have like a record of that. So people will be able to sort of see what the process of this live research project looks like for paying members, at least. So the idea is we need the AI, and we're going to need some humans to do a lot of heavy lifting, and then for the public facing stuff, it's going to be closer just to like a normal think tank where we have big papers and articles on specific topics. And I don't have to necessarily say specifically, here's all the theoretical reasons we're in a dark age. I can just say, here is 100 examples that you are free to research if you don't believe me that the orthodox paradigms are wrong, and a dark age would be a really good explanation for that.
Yeah, I agree. But you will need a place where people can come to those conclusions for themselves, because they won't listen. They won't. You can take a horse to water, but you cannot
Yeah,
make them
yeah,
drink. And
yeah,
the more tools you can put in the hands of people to feel like, and maybe feel like is an unfair way to put it, so that people can take ownership of their own learning and say, hey, I found this thing out, because there's nothing more exciting than learning something for yourself. And right now, I fear so much that the off ramps to self learning are being closed in front of us, and we're being put into a hall of mirrors. And so you think, well, what are those public going to do? Like you said about the expert class, there's a very real danger that you just siphon yourself back into that place and say, look, I know that you recognize you're inside of a hall of mirrors, but hold my hand, I'll get us out.
yeah.
Or I know you recognize you're inside of a hall of mirrors. Here's this tool. It's
Yes,
not perfect. It's the
both I
best thing
think is
we've
the
come up
answer.
with.
Yeah. I've got a lot of thoughts. We haven't really spoken about this yet, but I do have a lot of thoughts on the thing that the system. I've just interacted with it a little bit. There's some overlap there. I do have some ideas of ways that you could. What I would like to see is essentially the ability to create multiple different expert persona AIs that have been fed, 1,000 scientific papers,
Mm-hmm.
and you can sort of interrogate them. Anybody can interrogate them, but somebody who has some knowledge in the matter has already done it and then has written the article. So I would like a public facing thing like that, but that'll be a conversation we can get into later.
And offline as well, because your
Yeah, yeah,
view and what you want is definitively what's coming. So it's exciting stuff. Can
yeah.
you believe we've only just crossed paths since we share so many
Yeah, it's shocking.
overlapping areas? It's
It
weird.
is shocking, and it has been a delight. This has been such a stimulating and enjoyable conversation.
Yes, and it feels like I might not need to edit the podcast a huge amount. So
Yeah.
Steve will be back on the Digger soon enough for an unannounced podcast. Until then, you can find his work where, Steve?
Steve-Patterson.com is my website. I also have a Substack there. I do stuff on Twitter, but I sort of think I might end up eventually getting rid of social media. I'm not quite sure. And then if you're interested in the Natural Philosophy Institute, you can go to natphi.org, natphi.org, and I have an email list you could sign up for if you're interested in this institute that I'm building.
Great, Steve. Well, this has been great. I'm sure we will be talking again.
Thank you, Phil.